Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Adam Frost, and I'm the Exim Senior Vice President for the China and Transformational Exports Program. Welcome, everyone, to day 3 of our annual conference and the final breakout session for the China competition track. Our theme today is Sino-U.S. competition and the U.S. export community. So today I have the distinct honor to introduce to our audience one of the true experts in Sino-U.S. economics, and I should add, a friend and teacher who's helped me deepen my own understanding of the People's Republic of China more times than I actually care to admit. So please let me introduce Mr. Daniel Rosen. Mr. Rosen is a founding partner of Rhodium Group and leads the firm's work on China, India, and Asia. He has over 29 years of professional experience analyzing China's economy, commercial sector, and external relations. And I should add, from 2000 to 2001, Mr. Rosen was a senior advisor for international economic policy at the White House National Economic Council and the National Security Council. Mr. Rosen is widely recognized for his contributions on U.S.-China economic relations, and I should add, wrote an exceptionally insightful piece in the July-August edition of Foreign Affairs titled China's Economic Reckoning, the Price of Failed Reforms. So Dan, to kick off our conversation today, in April, President Biden stated that we're in a competition with China and other countries to win the 21st century. But let's be honest, for the U.S. exporter community, understanding how to navigate this increasingly complex geopolitical environment is really no easy thing. So can you help provide a little more historical context for our listeners, right? So effectively, how did we get here, right? How should we understand Sino-U.S. economic relations since we formally opened up relations in 1979?
Adam, thanks so much for having me for the conference this year. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I've learned a lot from you as well. And every day I'm watching to see how you and your colleagues are trying to sort of update and modernize the various functions the federal government performs to try to be competitive and keep us winning. You know, I'd first observed that the U.S. economy is really the winningest in history. Looking back over the past 100 years, just extraordinary. The amount of innovation, the dynamism that the U.S. has generated. And that continues to be, I think, the sort of baseline of American performance in the world and opportunity. But along the way, to keep that going has meant we need to, on the one hand, always maintain a constructive, optimistic attitude about how the world is unfolding, evolving, but also, when necessary, to update our interpretation of things along the way when things don't unfold in the most constructive manner. And that's sort of really where we are right now, I think, when it comes to sort of understanding the Chinese economy. I think what's most important right now is that we do sort of update our understanding of history so we can recognize new patterns in how we're competing around the world and cooperating as well around the world with an aspiring great power, China, and other nations out there. So I do think it's a really good idea to start with a quick review of sort of what got us to where we are right now and why the present changes are so jarring. 1979 is when we restarted diplomatic relations with China, but it was really 1971-72, President Nixon's détente with Beijing that defined the new era. And at that origin, it was really competition with a different great power, with the Soviet Union. That was the backbone of logic behind the U.S.-China relationship. And of course, the Soviet Union didn't last forever, in no small part because of the logic of marketization that was taking place in China more than anywhere. I think it wasn't just the problems of communism in Russia at that time, but Beijing's amazing success starting to implement market approaches to its own economy, not in a sort of smoke and mirrors way, but really profoundly letting the engines of marketization off the leash, to mix metaphors, and letting them reshape the Chinese system very, very profoundly. So after 1989, of course, China's Tiananmen problems, then after 1992, when China got back on track, it was engagement that was working. We defined American strategy as an engagement with China strategy, not in some woolly-eyed hopes that things would be different in China in the future, but because throughout those decades, China was radically changing and adjusting how it did things every day, was shutting down hundreds of thousands of state enterprises, laying off millions, tens of millions of state-owned enterprise workers, letting people take ownership of their own apartments and properties and houses for the first time in communist history. These were radical, radical shifts in how China operated, and they were quite advantageous to the American interest, and proof that the sort of liberal market model and even some of the democratic aspects that are core to how we do things were taking root in China. That was the case right through China's WTO accession, which I had a chance to be part of in 2000 at the White House and thereafter. But in the years since, the past 20 years, two things have happened. One, China started to misunderstand its own progress and attribute more of it to the Communist Party's sort of state interventions than it had previously done. And of course, it's 1.4 billion Chinese people and the private sector that have created all the jobs, all the new tax base in China in the past 50 years. The state hasn't done that much other than get out of the way. But China started to forget that. And on the other side of the Pacific, of course, not all of our performance here in the United States and in the market economy world was stellar. The distractions of the 2000s in terms of the global war on terror that were necessary definition of the times, the great global financial crisis after 2008, and our response to the pandemic more recently, all these things and others gave folks in Beijing room to argue that maybe their state-centered approaches would be better for China in the long run. And so that's where we are. We've come through a half century where almost all China's economic gains can be attributed to its serious attention to marketization. But now there's distraction in Beijing and a sort of misattribution of that success to other factors, to state intervention. And that's sort of restoked a debate about what's the right way to run your economy, not just in China, but in a lot of other developing countries as well. And so we're in a great power competition of development ideas as much as anything else right now. And that's sort of what brings us to where we are, I think.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you, Dan. It's a fascinating history as you look back of I think back to the 2000s and how we all sort of saw things unfold, and yet, but it always just sort of felt like a sharp turn that we've gone through in the last 5 years, which leads us to a really interesting question. So where are we, right? Where is here? And how should our audience and folks like myself and others in the U.S. government really start to understand the dynamics of what's unfolding in the Sino-U.S. economic relations?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of folks have said, and it's true, that competitiveness begins at home. And we need to understand and diagnose the challenges we have in our own system. Even if there wasn't a China on the face of the earth, we would still be wrestling with an inefficient healthcare system. And I think the pandemic just made that manifest. And, most heartbreakingly to all of us, I hope, the disunity, the fissures in our political society today and the nation are getting in the way of good policy making. We all know that. We're all hoping that we're starting to turn some corners there and put some wins on the board in terms of infrastructure. And of course, you guys at Exim have a mandate now to do your job, which for a long time had been tied up with politics. But you're very much back in the game. So we've got a whole set of things in the U.S. that need to get brought up to date in terms of how we make national policy, how the states and localities work with that, interact with that. On the Chinese side, I think as bad as, as challenging as those American problems are, I would say, democracy is the worst system except for all the others, to rephrase, I think, Churchill. And when we look at China's cards right now in their hand, there's two different sets of books here. On the surface, Beijing is describing a model for how the Chinese economy works, reporting performance for that model. That's captivating to firms around the world. They want to be part of China's growth. Other nations want to be able to access opportunities to export to China, for instance, which is sort of underpins a lot of the Belt and Road lending activity that China makes available out there. The vast majority of which, of course, flows back to China because those construction projects are going to be done by Chinese vendors, of course, right? Mm-hmm. But under the surface of what seems like a Chinese model that is able to adapt, and you got to give them credit. They've handled the pandemic much better than we have, to be frank. But through command and control approaches that aren't necessarily, what they need to get them the next lap around the track. And furthermore, when you look beyond the sort of official story of how things are going in China, look back the past 7 or 8 years in the Xi Jinping era, they've actually tried and failed to implement a dozen major economic reforms. For example, they've tried very hard to make the renminbi, their currency, an international currency, put it in international circulation, only to realize that they weren't ready to do so because that would make it possible for financiers to short the renminbi, to bet that it's going to go lower, and they were not comfortable with the consequences of that. They started to open the door for their own companies to go global and do everything from buying the Waldorf Astoria in New York to investing in a lot of other higher technology companies, only to find that the volume of Chinese money going out the door was so large that it frightened them. And so the gate was put back up. It wasn't really security screening in the US or Europe that was the primary reason why Chinese direct investment outflows have slowed down. They've tried to keep their Belt and Road funding goals on target, but so many of the investments they've made, the credits they've provided, have needed to be renegotiated, rolled over, and worked out. They're not financially sustainable arrangements. And that's given Beijing pause, actually, as to whether they really know what they're doing. These and many other reforms are not going the way that they were intended to go. And so each time China comes up short in implementing a sort of modernization reform for its financial system or its trade system, it has been falling back more and more on Communist Party solutions. Send in a crack squad of political party bosses and have them find an answer, find a solution. That's not as strategic as Beijing would like us to believe, and it brings a lot of inefficiencies to the model. So on the surface, we've got a China which is, of course, a pacing threat and a pure competitor like none other we've seen in half a century or more. But the reality is that China's got just as many, I would say, more problems than we do, working out how its economic model and economic system are supposed to function.
That's fascinating, and thank you, because it's so important, and why we need the help of folks like yourself and others understanding things, because there's so much media out there and so much press about what Beijing's saying and how they're portraying things, that it really is because of the opacity of the system. To understand what's happening beneath the surface, it's really complicated. So now, of course, I got to give you a softball, right? I mean, nobody has a crystal ball, right? But what does this mean? So where are we sort of going with this? There's folks that are on multiple sides of the spectrum that are saying this is something that's going to lead to a new Cold War. There are others that may not be quite there. So maybe even simpler for our audiences, what are the sort of political signals that you think our audience in the export community should be looking for to sort of best understand these dynamics and what their impacts could be on their businesses?
Yeah, you're right about not having a crystal ball. But if we sort of look at the underlying economic dynamics at work here, look at what's going well in China and what's not, the fact that Chinese domestic consumers are less and less a vital part of demand in China. China is relying more and more heavily right now on exports, net exports, as an engine of its growth. That can't really go on for very much longer. I would say not more than a year or two, really, before Beijing is going to have to acknowledge that a big component of how it's been organizing its economic strategy is not working the way it's intended. They're going to have to, at some point before too very long, find a way to turn back toward marketization, letting companies get back to work competing. Right now, the guidance from the top is entrepreneurs in China need to be patriots first and then think about the prosperity of their companies. I think we know that when you start, trying to politicize what business people do before they have a chance to run their firms on any given day, you're setting up for problems. That's not going to be very productive. So the signals I would be on the lookout for, of course, things are not getting any less sour right now in political sphere between Beijing and Washington. I would not hold my breath for sort of a breakthrough moment in U.S.-China economic relations anytime soon. I think this sort of in between period, while we're mostly trying to sort out where the other side is going, is going to persist for a couple years more. But at the same time, I would have my eyes, I would be keeping my pieces in position so that when China does make some acknowledgments that it needs to get back on the marketization train if it wants to make its economy productive, American firms and other firms from the market economy world that we're working with are well prepared, are able to recognize that quickly so they can move in an agile way to take advantage of those opportunities that might even be in China itself directly. In the meantime, it's having this sense of what China's real strengths and weaknesses are is, I think, key for you and also for the firms you're working with to tell a credible, powerful story in third markets where you're operating about, hey, before you take that Chinese approach at face value, let's talk a little bit about what is going well, what's not going well, and what Beijing has on offer, and let's look at what the U.S. Is able to make available to you now as well. And I think that is going to be sort of a core part of right sizing this international competition in the years ahead.
Well, it's fascinating, and frankly, a great sequitur over to the closing question I was going to ask you was. So I'll bring a little bit closer back to home. So we know that China's official export credit agencies do provide ample support to PRC companies that are looking to go out, right? And often, though there's a lot of opacity to these things, we do have sufficient evidence that a lot of these transactions are outside the norms that may be set by the OECD arrangement and the way a lot of Western companies do official export credit. So what do you think? I mean, what role should, for organizations like Exim or other Western export credit agencies, what role should we be playing in this? Obviously, I'm interested in Exim in particular, but how should we be helping our exporter community here in the U.S., U.S. financials, and frankly, the foreign buyers in the third countries you mentioned?
Yeah, Adam, that's the $1 trillion question, or 90 billion, I think, in your case.
27 billion, give or take. Yeah, yeah.
I've got, I think, three things that I would write on a little yellow sticky and put on the edge of my monitor if I were you. And I would hand those, I'd get those printed up and share them with your clients and listeners out there as well. Number one is that you guys are as close as what we've got to somebody on the front lines, seeing what the conditions of competition, what the terms are day in, day out. You see Chinese financing, also Japanese financing, and other major player financing out there every day, all over the world. And you've got a historical memory of it and how it's changing. So you've got a crucial role to sort of report back what's happening, offer as constructively as possible, good case studies and transparency around what the conditions of competition are like out there. I don't think anybody else in the U.S. government is going to be able to do that. Nobody else understands the commercial considerations the way you do. Obviously, our State Department have reporting officers all over the world that have been asked to keep an eye out for sort of how Chinese players are operating, but they don't understand the business side the way that I hope Exim does. I hope and know Exim does, in fact. So that's the first thing. Second thing, stick to high principles. The market economy nations have learned the hard way over the past 75, 80 years that you need things like the OECD arrangements on tied aid so that we don't race to the bottom against ourselves. So you don't have one market democracy undermining the good economic terms put on the table by another market democracy because they're trying to find some advantage for their market democracy companies. That way lies disaster. And we've figured out some excellent ways to try to tie our own hands from doing that. So we work together with a sense of what's really going to be developmentally positive for this 100 nations around the world that are under financed in terms of finishing the build out of their infrastructure. I think you've got a great story to tell if you keep to the high ground and describe that historic experience of working through some bad periods of enabling institutionally weak developing countries to build up too much debt, and the political, security, and economic problems that eventuated from that came from that. I don't think that folks in Beijing have learned those lessons because they haven't been out there operating around the world as major financiers the way that you are and the way that we have for the past 75 years, I would say. Next point. However we do this, we've got to look for the efficiencies of doing it together with other market economies. Almost any of us alone are not going to be able to talk about a magnitude of presence in development finance, infrastructure finance, export finance, the same way that the Chinese are able to talk about it. Now, as I said before, I'm not sure what the Chinese are talking about is actually what they're able to do now at the margin because they've got their own problems. But nonetheless, we need to not miss the opportunity to bundle together what Europe is doing, what Japan is doing, what Canada is doing, many others in the advanced economy world. If we kind of just put it all on the same piece of paper, this is actually what we've got on offer every day in terms of finance tools. I think that tells a very impressive story compared with anybody, including with the People's Republic of China. And then final point, I think, the really tragic misstep taking place in Beijing right now, as I alluded to before, is the leadership coming to believe that they were more important to China's success than the role of China's private sector. I think they will come to regret putting that message in play and forgetting that it was private, dynamic companies, entrepreneurs, workers, people, including foreign, participating in China, that were the wellspring of China's current prosperity. So as we look for the appropriate role, magnitude, and flavor of government finance out there globally, such as Exim is providing, I think it's crucial that at every moment we are looking for ways to show that we are crowding in private sector activity from the United States, from like-minded other advanced market economies working together with you and with American companies, and especially private sector activity on the ground in the countries in which we're looking to operate. That should be our greatest comparative advantage, that we've never taken our eye off the ball of private sector leadership in what makes an economy run well and sustainably.
It's fantastic advice, Dan. Thank you so much. And I think so much of what you just said aligns greatly with sort of the direction Exim is in, where we're going, and how we're trying to find innovative ways to help our exporters. Regrettably, I could do this all day, and I think some folks who are listening today would enjoy it if we kept get going. But I believe I'm on a time limit, so let me please close by saying thank you so much, Dan. As always, I learn something every time we have a chance to discuss. I look forward to getting together with you again in the near future. And I can't thank you enough for contributing to the China competition track here at our annual conference. We owe you one.
My pleasure. Anytime. Please let me know how I can help. All the best.
Appreciate it. Hey, thanks everybody for paying attention to this. We have a Q&A session coming up and a few more other interviews for this session soon following. Thank you. Hey, welcome back everyone to day 3 of the China track at our session here at the Exim's annual conference. Again, I'm Adam Frost. I'm your Senior Vice President for the Program and Transformational Exports here. So our audience, you just heard from Rhodium Group's Dan Rosen. He gave us a brief history of Sino-U.S. economic relations, a sense of where things are, and his interpretation of where things are going. So I wanted to continue this conversation during today's track. And I suspect our audience doesn't know this, but here at Exim, we retain a crack team of economists that help us at the bank understand the global risk landscape that we work with to try to support U.S. exporters. It's a little known jewel here at Exim, but I can tell you that their analysis is truly insightful, and it's an invaluable behind the scenes asset to Exim and its exporter community. So we're incredibly lucky. We're joined here today by two of our best. First up, it's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Aryam Vasquez. Mr. Vasquez is the chief economist and head of the country risk and analysis and economic analysis team here at Exim. For background, he and his team, they are responsible for developing and communicating the bank's global macroeconomic views, outlook, and forecasts, while also leading the team's efforts in monitoring, communicating, and standardizing the country risk assessments for all U.S. government agencies. Now, Mr. Vasquez joined Exim back in February of 2020, bringing with him over 20 years, 2 decades of experience in international economics, the majority of which was spent in the private sector at numerous financial services firms. Most recently, for instance, he was served as managing director and head of global macro strategy at SunTrust Bank. Now, also joining us here is Ms. Manli Zhang. Ms. Zhang joined Exim in 2000 and has served as the lead economist responsible for the Asia region, where she conducts the in-depth research and to assess the economic, financial, and political conditions that impact the country's creditworthiness. Now, I should note that Ms. Zhang also performs research on the foreign exchange markets and evaluates foreign country eligibility for Exim Bank's foreign currency guarantee program. She's an active participant in the OECD Country Risk Experts Forum and has served on Exim's rating task force for numerous years. Prior to career at Exim, Dr. Zhang was a director of international business programs at American University's Washington Semesters program and taught international business and economics. All right, Aryam, Manli, we got easy topics, easy stuff to talk about today. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you help us in the audience put the Sino-U.S. economic discussion we just had into a little bit of context? I mean, what else is shaping this environment that our exporters have to deal with today? You know, how would we sort of put this stuff in a larger context that we're seeing the Sino-U.S. relationship play out in? Aryam, any thoughts?
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, thank you for giving us this opportunity to join your program here. So look, I'd say we're definitely in the midst of a transformative shift of major global importance. China, I would say, after decades and decades of subjugation, is indeed and without any doubt challenging American supremacy. China has steadily and very quietly moved from being this reliant, this dependent, multilateral actor on the global stage to becoming a very active and most recently a very intrusive, detached, and I'd even say multidimensional actor. It's a superpower that I think today not only thwarts American influence across a number of dimensions, but I think it's trying to use its position of power and force, whether it's moral, economic, political, military force worldwide. And I think we're looking at Sino-U.S. tensions today. They are the dominant factor across the global macro political landscape. And the threat of heightened tensions and discord between the world's 2 major superpowers, I think, constitute a most important, if not the most important, risk threat, I would say, bearing on the global outlook. China and the U.S. are seemingly at odds with respect to objective, substance, I would even say style. And they're a threat to the U.S. because China has already exceeded this economic, political, and the military impact of earlier rivals the U.S. and I would say even the West has faced. And going forward, it certainly looks like it will be much more difficult to counter and contain that threat. The reality in the world today is that, and for the U.S. in particular, we have never had to deal with a global power of this size, of this scope, of this strength. And today, more than ever, China's superpower status, I think it stems from its vast global footprint across a number of spheres, numbers of dimensions, and most importantly, that is playing out on the economic front. For the U.S. and for other leading powers, China seems to be a disruptive economic force. And I think it basically stems from its unique position. It's the world's largest market for many products. It's the most important driver of global trade, global supply chains. It's the most critical actor, I would say, as the world's most preeminent driver in terms of industries and sectors. It's increasingly enough a provider of global capital, global finance. And you're seeing day by day as it's strengthening its domestic demand-led economy. And I think that will eventually help China drive and shape the state of global consumption. So I think these manifestations are just some of the major and more important theaters, aside from the geopolitical theater, where you're going to see this global environment primarily be very, very much influenced by this power struggle between China and the United States.
Well, thank you for that. Manli, any additional thoughts you'd like to add to Aryam's analysis?
Yes, thank you, Adam. Thank you for inviting us to join your panel. I believe there is a confluence of factors at play here. I totally agree with what Aryam has mentioned. I believe competition or confrontation in some cases will continue to be the order of the day. As Aryam mentioned, it has to do with China's rise as a major economic power in the world. I want to actually give a few numbers to bring a granular look at the economic progress China has made, putting in historical perspective. Let's look at 1980. That's around the time China started its unprecedented economic reform. We're dealing with trade. So China's total exports of goods and services accounted for less than 1% of the world trade. Fast forward to 2020, China's share in the global trade rose to nearly 14%. As of, I believe, 2013, China's total exports exceeded those of the US, surpassing the US, becoming the world's largest trading nation. The second number I want to actually cite is the size of the economy. In 1980, China's economy is around 11% of US economy and accounting for only 3% of the world economy. Fast forward to 2020, China's economy rose to around 71% of US economy, accounting for 17% of the world economy. And there are several studies out there that China will surpass the US in GDP in not so distant future. The reason I mentioned the economic rise is to bring the point that China has been emboldened through this process. China feel that China is a competitor for the US, as Mr. Rosen mentioned. There has to do some miscalculation, has to do some underestimation of the US power, economic, political, military alike. And at the same time, overestimation of China's power, political, economic, military. So China is competing with the US in the region, Asia Pacific region, and the rest of the world for exports, markets, investment resources, and also the leading edge in technology. China wants to be the next leading technology power in the world. So in many Asian countries, we have seen China becoming the #1 trading partner, a spot used to belong with the US years ago. In addition, China is also competing for influence in the world. In Chinese terms, 话语权, the right to speak at the table, the influence to shaping the new world order. So I think China does have an ambitious goal of setting up China-centric economic order regionally and globally, this time rivaling the existing system led by the US and the West. The Belt and Road Initiative would be a case in point, although
Absolutely.
It has run into all kinds of problems.
That's right.
Yeah, especially amid COVID pandemic, as also mentioned by Mr. Rosen. The final point that I want to also make, in this competitive and confrontational dynamics, there is also a considerable degree of interdependence in terms of trade, financial, scientific, and even research links between China and US. This has to do with decades of economic reforms and deepening integration with the global economy on China part. So many American firms have set up shops and factories in China, and which has become the largest market for them, and China also has set up shops here in the US. I believe China also is dependent on US for technology, resources, and markets as well. So I see competition and confrontation continuing going forward.
My goodness, this is fantastic. Well, thank you both for that analysis. So as we look at the Sino-U.S. economic tension, so to ask a macroeconomics question of you both, right? So people always rightfully here at Exim and in other places take these political risk variables into the calculus as you look at it, as Aryam says, the global outlook, right? So in the Sino-U.S. competition part, it's a huge economic relationship, but there's political tension between the governments. How would you recommend our export community or other analysts, folks looking at this situation, effectively relatively weight the importance of the political military tensions between the U.S. relative to, let's say, economic fundamentals about the positive of a business environment or other macroeconomic dimensions? So, I mean, is the Sino-U.S., the political tension, they just noise relative to the fundamentals, or do we think it's sort of driving things a little bit more?
Manli, go ahead.
Okay.
Give me first stab.
Sorry, I should have called one out. My mistake.
You're good. You're good.
It's okay. I always would defer to my chief economist. First, I believe it is prudent and important to have updated understanding of what is going on in our competitors' market, in our rivals' market, or in our markets. So in this case, China, there is strength and weakness that we need to actually take into consideration when we are doing business with China. There's, I believe there's a policy shift recently that actually I like to bring it to people's attention. There's a policy shift, to me, moving away from market-oriented approaches in economic policies, and probably on a bigger scale or spectrum. It also may signal a significant shift moving towards bigger market. I will use the recent regulatory crackdowns as an example. As we have seen, the regulatory crackdowns first on technology firms, and now on private tutoring industries. We see actually an anti-capitalist edge in terms of state gaining more control over the sectors of the economy, almost across all sectors of the economy, and more importantly, over private enterprises. As Mr. Rosen mentioned in the panel discussion earlier, Chinese leadership started to misunderstand its own economic miracle, you can use that word, attributing more of its economic success to its role, to the state intervention, to the command and control way of doing things, rather than market-oriented approaches, rather than marketization efforts. As we know, it all started in 1979. And I mentioned the 1980 number. It brought tremendous transformation in the economy, in China's export competitiveness, in China's influence, regionally and globally. Right. But it seems that the leadership lost track. You know, it's now there's a dangerous trend that it is moving more towards command and control, government intervention, big government. I believe this has to do probably with, you know, their response to the pandemic, as we have seen, you know, very strong state-centered approach, top-down, tough measures in terms of mobility restrictions, in terms of segregation measures, trying to, you know, to crush the COVID cases almost to zero. So I believe they have the zero COVID approach. So in this case, I think they feel they are emboldened in a way that they were right. They were doing this government control and it proved to be effective. So they were trying to apply that to other sectors of the country, the economy. This is a very dangerous sign. I believe, it has social repercussions or political repercussions as well. Let me cite another number that has to do with China's GDP. It has to do with people, living standards. So in 1980, China has only about $320 per GDP GDP per capita, which places it among the low income country ranks, according to World Bank. Right now, GDP per capita is around 10,200 US. Now China advanced to the upper middle income countries. The reason I want to mention the GDP per capita is through the past 4 decades, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the leadership have derived their legitimacy of governing from sustaining economic growth, improving the living standards of people. We all know it is not the government of the people, by the people. So by doing so, China has lifted millions of its citizens from poverty. However, by moving away from marketization, by moving away from the approaches that got them where they are now, actually have a political and social impact.
Yeah, they could be running into the wall. So, and I know our time is short, but let me ask Aryam for some closing thoughts here. I mean, so what does this mean for our U.S. exporter community, particularly in third markets? And what does it mean? We are, this is Exim Bank, right? This is the house of U.S. exports. And what does this mean for competition in third markets? And where do you think this is all going?
So look, I think, first and foremost, I think we need to differentiate between Wall Street and Main Street. And I think Main Street probably has a better understanding of China, the risks, the challenges, and the expectations than Wall Street does. While the Wall Street crowd is more interested in making money and investing and capturing these opportunities in China, I think Main Street here in the United States is a little bit more understanding and willing to not take on more risk, but take a more moderate approach and more sensible approach. And I think they're more attentive, they're more responsible, they're probably more flexible. I think the state of the global macro-political backdrop will be marked by this constant superpower rivalry for years to come. And yes, we're likely to see periods of cooperation, engagement, pockets of coactivity, but this doesn't negate the fact that the U.S.-China relationship is increasingly looking like a win-lose economic struggle that will test each nation, basically, will test each nation and how they interact globally and across regions, across markets, across sectors, across industries. The impact of this struggle, I think, if we're going to look at areas, if business and corporations are going to focus on areas to see how this battle is shaping out, battle for superiority, for influence, for dominance, I think it focuses on market share, on the global supply chain, on competition, and the geopolitical realm. I think these 4 areas will give us a little bit more clarity and granularity and vision as to who's winning the struggle, or who's up, who's down. I think those are the areas that we really need to focus on. Those are prime areas of struggle, if you will.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And listen, folks, it's been a lovely conversation. Hopefully our audience walks away from this reassured the degree of the attention, the expertise that Exim has focusing on these issues constantly, day in, day out, because we here at Exim are incredibly serious about this competition and about trying to find ways to help the American exporter community and American jobs compete in this 21st century as the president's called for. So my thanks to you both for joining us today. And I do hope our audience really enjoyed the conversation. The first of many. I just think we will probably be doing this again next year at the annual conference. And if everybody checks my inbox, you'll see there's numerous conversations between me, Aryam, and Manli about these topics almost on a daily basis. So once again, thank you both for joining us. And thank you to Dan Rosen for the conversation earlier. And thank you all for joining us today at the Exim 2021 Annual Conference.